Sophie Hensley is saying hi to you.
Someone is? Let's see. I think we can go ahead and get started. Well, good afternoon and welcome. Welcome everyone to the Hostile Terrain 94 panel discussion at DePaul University. I'm Angela Castaneda, professor of anthropology, and I'm going to be moderating our panel discussion. Unfortunately, we aren't able to come together in Peeler Art Center to have this discussion and for the opening reception of HT94. But I want to just say that despite the new challenges and obstacles, our HT94 community was dedicated and enabled us to continue with our planning for the exhibit. And I know since we can't all be there, I wanted to just show a few images from the installation of the exhibit. So I'm just going to do this real quick. And there were so many students, faculty, staff, alumni, and emeritus faculty who collaborated to make HT94 a reality on our campus. I want to thank all of you for the countless hours of physical and emotional labor that went into planning, creating, and installing the HT94 exhibit at DePaul. Without the commitment of our DePaul University community, including generous funding and support from the Prindle Institute for Ethics and Peace and Conflict Studies, as well as my colleagues at the Tenzer Technology Center, Peeler Art Center, and the Department of Art and Art History, this exhibit and panel would not have been possible. In particular, I want to give a very special thanks to my colleagues, Professor Meredith Brickell and Professor Glenn Keeker, for their unwavering support and guidance throughout this project. So just a few more pictures here. So this afternoon, we are honored to have with us two wonderful panelists, Professor Boyce and Professor Alexander. Unfortunately, one of our original panelists, Carla Guerrero, was unable to be with us today, but we wish her well. First, we will hear from Professor Jeffrey Allen Boyce. Professor Boyce lives in Tucson, Arizona, where he works as the academic director of the Earlham College Border Studies program. Dr. Boyce spent more than a decade working with the Southern Arizona humanitarian organization, No More Deaths, and he still serves as a consultant for the organization in its negotiations with the US government. And we also have with us our very own Associate Professor of Education Studies and Chair of the Education Studies Department, Rebecca Alexander. Professor Alexander's research addresses how young people and their families navigate the intersection of multiple borders: nation, neighborhood, language, identity, status, etc. In the US. And she has taught many courses focused on borders and border studies. She's active in Global Liberal Arts Association with border studies work, and she's on the advisory board of Earlham College's Border Studies program. Her class, Youth, Families, and Borders, prepared to work on the HT94 exhibit prior to our COVID-related departure from campus last semester. And this semester, she facilitated a virtual HT94 tag filling session. And I also want to say that Professor Alexander has been involved with the planning for our HT94 exhibit from the very beginning, so thank you. So I've asked each panelist to prepare a brief 10 to 15-minute presentation discussing how their current work connects with the many themes explored in the HT94 exhibit. Following these presentations, we'll switch our conversation to a Q&A. So throughout the webinar, feel free to insert your questions into the chat or into the Q&A box. And Professor Boyce, we're going to begin with you, so welcome.
Thank you, and thank you to Professor Castaneda and to everybody at DePaul for organizing this, for inviting me. It's a real privilege to have a chance to talk with you all this afternoon. So I'm going to try to figure out how to share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. I'll try to keep my comments short. Before I get into really the substance of my talk, I thought I would say a couple more words about the Border Studies program where I work. we are a GLCA accredited off-campus study program, which means that any student at DePauw can spend a semester with us if you're particularly excited about the issues that we're talking about today, if you want to learn more, etc. Our program is based in Tucson, Arizona, but we really use the transnational US-Mexico borderlands as our classroom. So in addition to taking a full suite of classes in a semester with us, all students do a homestay with mostly Spanish-speaking families. We travel on both sides of the border to different communities, learn about organizations on the front lines of a number of the current issues related to the US-Mexico border: migration, human rights, globalization, trade, etc. And we also do extended trips to southern Mexico and the US-Guatemala border. And finally, students with us do an internship. So there's also an opportunity to really get hands-on experience again with different organizations on the front lines of some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So I was asked to share a little bit about my research. I've been interested kind of in a general sense in the impacts of the buildup of Homeland Security and in particular border policing in the US over the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades or so. In particular, what are the lived experiences of the communities who've become the targets of this kind of policing activity? And in fact, a lot of this work has focused on the Midwest. So I spent a couple of years doing field work on and off in Michigan and Ohio, looking at Border Patrol practices on the northern border, which turns out is quite substantial. There has been, since September 11th, a disproportionate growth of border policing on the northern border, including in the Midwest. So, you know, in collaboration with different organizations, including the ACLU in Michigan, we've tried to understand basically where these arrests take place, what are the patterns, and again, what are the impacts? And we'll have a report coming out next month that summarizes some key findings that we hope will really help to address those policies moving forward. But today, I want to pivot and really talk about some of the issues that circulate around the hostile terrain exhibit, and where, you know, and that also brings me a little bit closer to home, to Tucson, Arizona, where I live, and where I also have a long-term set of research relationships with organizations like No More Deaths, et cetera. In the process of talking about that, one of the things that I want to try to do briefly is really historicize the Trump era and a number of policies that have been implemented over the last 4 years, some of which I imagine will be familiar to those of you who are watching this presentation, because of course they've attracted a lot of controversy. But as is highlighted in the hostile terrain exhibit, and as if you've studied these issues, will be apparent to you, right? The militarization of the border, the human rights and humanitarian implications of this do not start under Donald Trump. And I think that's really important to recognize and acknowledge, right? Because we are in a we're talking today right before a really consequential moment for our country. But I think it's a mistake to believe that, for example, were Joe Biden to be elected president, right, a lot of the policies that we're talking about today will automatically go away, or that indeed, like a Biden presidency is automatically going to bring forward a real shift to how we approach the border. I think that instead, right, we need to understand that for those of us who care about these issues and who care about the consequences of current US border policy, we're going to continue to need to mobilize, apply pressure, make our voices heard, regardless of the outcome of this election. And just to drive that point home a little bit further, right? If you've read, for example, Jason De Leon's book, The Land of Open Graves, right? If you've studied the current moment of border militarization that we're living in, right? You know that it was really President Bill Clinton in 1994 who really set us on the trajectory that we're on today by inaugurating the first ever nationwide border patrol strategy. Which was titled Prevention Through Deterrence. And I want to just briefly, before we go forward, address some of the key, right, underpinning logic of this policy and what it intended to do, right? So prevention through deterrence was based on this idea of, first of all, trying to disrupt routine unauthorized movement back and forth within urban border cities like El Paso and San Diego, and by doing so to push unauthorized migration out into remote desert areas and, famously into more hostile terrain, what the Border Patrol said would be less suited for crossing, more suited for enforcement. And from the very get-go, right, the government understood and acknowledged that this would cause an increase in mortality, right, that the conditions that people would be channeled into would be really dangerous, and put their lives at risk. And yet, right, the intention was that through basically the cumulative effect of the hardship involved, right, the suffering that would then be involved in crossing through these really difficult areas where the climate is extreme, the terrain is extreme, the danger involved, the financial costs, the exposure to violence, et cetera, right, the kind of again, the hardship, the suffering, the stress, the risk that all this involved would eventually accumulate to the point that it would be a deterrent. And people would decide, right, it's no longer worth the effort of crossing the border unlawfully, and they would stop. This was the idea of prevention through deterrence. And I think it's worth rehearsing this because this is the logic, this continues to be the logic by which, since 1994, US border enforcement has consistently expanded and evolved, and we can trace this same logic through every single policy that has followed, right? So under Clinton, we saw the very first walls going up in urban areas. Again, the concentration of enforcement in these places. It did lead to an increase in the number of people who've died, and one of the principal ways that this happened was not just through the exposure to hostile terrain and to climactic extremes, but also by significantly an elongation of the amount of time that it takes to cross the border. So instead of like a clandestine entry taking maybe a few minutes crossing through a chain link fence and getting into an urban area like Nogales, where you could arrange your transportation further north. Now crossing is going to take a day or 2 days or 3 days or 4 or 6 or 10 days to arrive at a point where you're rendezvousing with a smuggler and you're getting a ride further into the country. And all that time you're being exposed to the environmental extremes of the Southwest desert. So each one of these dots on this map, similar to the hostile terrain exhibit, right, represents a person who's died on the border. And actually this map depicts a similar area of southern Arizona as the exhibit concentrates on. So after prevention through deterrence, we did see an increase in deaths on the border. We know that by 1996, the government was not only acknowledging that this policy was helping to contribute to death, but actually using an increase in deaths as a potential indicator of the success of the strategy itself, so as a metric, right? This continued, right? Under George W. Bush, right? This general policy architecture continued to be expanded. And so in 2006, George W. Bush passed the Secure Fence Act. This is when we saw a mandate and funding for the construction of 700 plus miles of walls along the border. And we saw a doubling of the size of the Border Patrol. So there was a hiring surge that began in 2006. On the top here, I mean, there were massive engineering projects. This was a canyon outside of San Diego that was literally filled in with material in order to build the wall through there. On the bottom right is, this is actually the campus of the University of Texas at Brownsville. And this fence with the white post that you see, that's the border wall. It cuts through the heart of campus, and on the cutting basically most of the classroom and administrative buildings off from the athletic facilities on the other side of the wall. And students actually get a pass from the Department of Homeland Security to be able to go and use the rec center and use the sports fields, et cetera. We also saw under Bush an expansion of checkpoints in the interior of the country, what the Border Patrol calls defense in depth. And again, this wasn't so much intended to catch people who are driving through the checkpoints so much as to push people out further into the desert around that. And if any of you have seen the 2020 Netflix documentary, Immigration Nation, there's a pivotal scene where they're talking about the checkpoints, and there's a uniformed Border Patrol agent who acknowledges, he says, the checkpoints act as a funnel. They're basically, they'll basically push them out into the mountains, and then the film actually cuts to a CBP helicopter pilot who then says, you know, once they get out here, literally, they are literally physically beat by the environment. So here we have government officials in a moment of candor really acknowledging this spatial logic behind the mobilization of the checkpoints. We also had the expansion of the first really comprehensive what gets called as a virtual fence or a smart border project. And I've done a lot of research on this, and I'll share a little bit of that here. And I think it's worth talking about because it continuously is, this kind of technology program is continuously offered by, for example, Senate Democrats and congressional Democrats as a more sophisticated alternative to the you know, kind of the buildup of walls. And, you know, you hear this rhetoric that, well, we don't need a, you know, 17th century solution to a 21st century problem. So instead, the alternative proposed is let's contract with Boeing and Elbit Systems and all these tech companies to build these high-tech surveillance systems. So the first really comprehensive one was started in 2006 called SBInet. And together with a couple of colleagues, I've published a couple of papers really examining in detail this program. And in one of these, we plotted out based on publicly available information, basically the view shed of these cameras, where they could physically see based on where they were located. And then what we did was using GIS, we made an overlay of terrain conditions to calculate basically the amount of energy, right, that a person would need to expend, measured in the form of calories, to cross this landscape. And we selected a number of basically random transects and calculated a least cost path, which is a standard calculation of the easiest way to move through a landscape based on GIS modeling. So, you know, if you're in a valley, it would be at the valley bottom. And we calculated, you know, without SBInet, what are the easiest ways to cross the desert, across these random transects. And then if you take into account the view shed of the surveillance towers, and you were trying to avoid that view shed, what would be the least cost paths for crossing the desert, which you see here depicted in purple. And what we found was that if people try to avoid the surveillance towers, right, it results in a much more difficult route of travel, even if they're crossing the same linear distance, right? So the number of calories because of the terrain that you're moving up and down through increases substantially. And it just so happens that this period of time when the surveillance towers were deployed corresponds to a period of time when the rate of mortality in the border increased significantly. So you know, just between 2007 and 2009, it more than doubled. This is the ratio of the number of human remains recovered from the desert to the number of Border Patrol apprehensions. So basically, you know, essentially how many people are dying proportional to the number of people crossing. And we also plotted where these remains were recovered. And what we found was, in fact, that there was a statistically measurable shift of mortality to areas outside the range of the surveillance towers into these more difficult crossing areas. And so what this tells us is that, this environmental logic first posited in 2004 explicitly, right, behind prevention through deterrence, continues to animate the expansion of infrastructure as border militarization has continued. And I think we're continuing to see this with the expansion of the wall and also related infrastructure associated with that under Trump. Under Obama, of course, we saw a historic number of deportations from the interior of the country through increased ICE activity. But we also saw this logic of deterrence in the desert expanded to into what are called almost euphemistically, right, post-apprehension consequences, which was once again explicitly justified under the name of deterrence. So if the hardship of crossing the desert isn't enough of a deterrent, what we're going to do is now add prison sentences, right, subject people to criminal prosecution for unlawfully crossing the border. Being undocumented is not a criminal offense, but unlawfully entering the border outside of a port of entry is. And so we see these mass prosecution programs like Operation Streamline, as a result of which criminal prosecutions for immigration-related offenses are now a plurality of all federal cases, all federal charges in the United States. There's also a shift under Obama in the demographics of who's crossing, markedly toward people from Central America, fleeing conditions of violence and instability in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And to deal with that, in 2014, the Obama administration brought back family detention, which had ended at the beginning of his administration. And so this current moment of family detention actually starts under Obama, not Trump. And then Obama also pushed deterrence into Mexico through bilateral programs like Programa Frontera Sur, where the Mexican government concentrated immigration checkpoints and enforcement throughout the country to really try to disrupt the routes of travel that Central Americans were using to arrive at the border. And so we've also seen historic numbers of deportations from Mexico to the Central American countries. And all of this now brings us to the Trump era. Trump, famously has added a number of additional deterrent measures to try to limit people's ability to access the asylum system. This included metering, limiting the number of people who can petition for asylum on any given day, right? So what this has done is created backlogs that take months to clear in border cities where asylum seekers are arriving without any kinds of resources, and they're forced to live on the streets or in ad hoc encampments. Often they're not able to work. There's a lot of violent crime, organized crime and predation, kidnapping, extortion, et cetera, that people are vulnerable to in these communities, and they're basically stranded. Trump also famously initiated in 2018 a policy of family separation, which was basically just an expansion of Operation Streamline. So prior to this family separation policy, parents who arrived at the border who were arrested with young children would be exempt from criminal prosecution. The only policy shift really that led to family separation was the Department of Justice saying, we're no longer going to make that exemption. We're going to subject those parents as well to criminal prosecution. When they're put in prison, that means their children have to be taken from them and placed somewhere else. That's how that policy came about, and of course caused a great deal of uproar and outrage. We've seen the migrant protection protocols, which require people to wait in Mexico for the duration of their immigration case in the United States. This has not only disenfranchised tens of thousands of people. I mean, we know from folks who have studied this, as well as anecdotal evidence from immigration attorneys, right, that lots of people subjected to MPP basically wind up forfeiting their ability to make their case because the conditions are so unstable. The government will change the date of their court date, and there's no way for them to contact the defendant in Mexico. and but also as people are waiting, they're still subjected to the same conditions of vulnerability and hardship that folks who've been subjected to metering are, right? So again, we see people living on the streets in ad hoc tent cities, et cetera. And all of these policies have been justified, again, in the name of deterrence. So this was former White House Chief of Staff, former Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly, was interviewed in 2018. I'll skip to the bottom. He says, he's talking about family separation, and he says here, well, he says, they don't speak English. Obviously, that's a big thing. They don't speak English. They don't integrate well. They don't have skills. They're not bad people. They're coming here for a reason, and I sympathize with the reason, but the laws are the laws. And a big name of the game is deterrence. Family separation stands as a pretty tough deterrent, a much faster turnaround on asylum seekers. Here, talking about MPP, we have Homeland Security officials, in this case, quoted in the New Yorker saying, MPP will reduce claims, the number of aliens taking advantage of US law and discourage false asylum claims. Going on to say, it's the logical extension of the consequence delivery system. By the logic of it, MPP is the biggest deterrent of all. And finally, this brings us to the current moment that we're living under, COVID-19, where the government has essentially ended asylum. People can no longer lawfully apply for asylum in the United States, which under US and international law, they ought to have a right to do. So they're just stuck in Mexico. And this has led to a surge of people, once again, going around the ports of entry because, again, they're not able to access them to petition for asylum. So they're crossing, once again, clandestinely through the desert. And in so doing, attempting to avoid surveillance towers, checkpoints, having to cross through these remote areas. And once again, we're seeing a surge in the number of people who are dying, whose remains are being recovered from the desert. This is a news article from just last week talking about precisely this issue. And so the count at this point in Southern Arizona for this year is upwards of 180. We haven't seen numbers like that since 2014. So I just want to wrap up my comments here, and I look forward to the questions and answers and et cetera. But by reflecting on 2 points related to this question of deterrence and the policies that have been informed by it, that we've seen for the last 25 years being rolled out. And the first is that by its own logic, right, in order for deterrence to work, the United States has to impose a degree of hardship and suffering that is in excess, right, of the dangers or the suffering that people are trying to cross the border to escape, whether that's the anguish of being separated long-term from your own family, from your own children or a spouse, or right, the conditions of violence and danger in a lot of the countries that people are fleeing from. So in order for the architecture of deterrence to actually prevent people from crossing the border, again, the level of hardship that it needs to impose actually has to be, under its own logic, right, greater than those harms that people are attempting to escape. And that, I think, ought to give, first of all, give all of us pause, because I think that the question we need to ask is what does that then say about our own country, right? And ethically, right, and morally, the kinds of actions that are being undertaken in our own names, right? As for those of us who are, citizens of this country and voters, et cetera. I think that the logic of this, I think, on its face is troubling, if not monstrous. And what we've seen is that it hasn't worked. And so over time, the government continues to pose, the entire history of the last 25 years of border enforcement is that as the deterrent policy fails to obtain its intended effect, right, the government just ratchets it up further. So we have to then understand that the collateral consequences of this isn't just the people who are dying and disappearing on the border, as horrible as that is, and as painful for all the families impacted, but also then the widespread family separation, all of the human consequences of this that we can name and identify. And the last thing that I'll say for ending here is that, I think all of this is a reflection of a policy that's attempting to address all the reasons why people are crossing the border by essentially piling on this architecture of violence, essentially, this architecture of deterrence at the border itself, right? Whereas all of these issues that are driving people to cross the border or to want to cross the border in the first place really have nothing to do with that border itself, right? They have to do with the fact that, maybe economic conditions and they want to work in the United States to earn a salary that they can support themselves and invest in their children's education or in their future. Or it has to do with the fact that because of the failure of our own immigration laws, they're separated long-term, and really the cruelty of those laws, right? People are separated long-term from one another, and they're desperate to return to their family in the US, to their homes and the lives that they've built here. Or, right, it has to do with like the incredible violence and insecurity in other countries that people are fleeing. And none of those issues can be resolved at the border itself. And yet we're in this policy paradigm where that's basically become the almost singular focus of where federal investment is being made, right? And again, almost entirely under this framework of trying to maximize, hardship and suffering. And so I think that really what is required is an entirely different way of thinking about the problem, and and thinking about it in a different way geographically, right? The border is not the place we should be paying attention to if we want to address the reasons why people are crossing that border in the first place.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that. We're going to hold off on our questions till after Professor Alexander goes. So I'm going to invite Professor Alexander to join us and give her remarks.
Oops, I need to end screen share, don't I? You are muted.
I said, thank you so much, Professor Boyce. I learn so much from you every time you speak, and I'm so grateful for that wealth of background. And Professor Castañeda, thank you so much for putting this project together and all of the time and energy and work and labor you have invested in this over the past couple years now. And also thank you to Professor Keeker and Professor Brickell, who've been just so outstanding. I am going to pivot a little bit onto just thinking about the way my course at DePauw and my work at DePauw sort of works with and has taken up and engaged with this exhibit. And as I do that, I want to think about just acknowledge my own presence, and we all come to this land in different ways, but I am here as an uninvited settler on Miami and Kickapoo Indigenous land. I was raised on Ohlone Indigenous land. And it's really important as we enter into this space, I want us to think about the US-Mexico border in particular as a very recent construction, less than, the nation state boundary as less than 200 years old, and in a 30,000 year indigenous history in the Americas. And so, and thinking of it as something temporary, unnatural, strange, and that there is a past without it, there will also be a future without it. And so just invoke Gloria Anzaldua's reminder that the sea cannot be fenced. And situate us within that space, and situate us also in thinking about the constant movement, the constant motion that is the world. the movement up and down from deep within and to the surface of the earth, the movement of the tides and the oceans, the movement of the air, the movement of viruses and microbes and bacteria, the movement of finance, capital, and goods, the movement of human bodies, and that life is motion. And that, you know, when I work with students and we think about both the right to migrate as a fundamental human right, and the right not to migrate, and what it means to honor both of those things, to the right to not be forced out of your home, and also the freedom of people's movement across the earth, which is not to say the freedom of occupation. And so we came into this work thinking about Jason Leonsworth, and I was really introduced to his work through his State of Exception exhibit, which this is a photo of it from 2017, but De Leon began doing this archaeology of the desert and of the Arizona desert, and really trying to be present with and document and I get honor the artifacts, the things left behind, the things that migrants carry, and use those as a way of telling a different story than we may have heard about migration, and a way of really humanizing the process and of border crossing, and drawing awareness to I think part of the project has been about the unique violences and the structural violences of the US-Mexico border, and of US policy on the border, have always been a center of this. And part of how De Leon has illuminated those violences is by working to highlight the uniqueness and multiplicity of people who cross the border. And so we talked as we moved into thinking about the hostile terrain exhibit in particular, and doing that work with students, and doing that as an individual. The exhibit raised a lot of questions. I'm not ready to go to that side yet. It raised a lot of questions for us. So my class, my Youth, Families, and Borders class, which was a class dedicated to unpacking the idea of the border, unpacking the construct of family, unpacking the construct of youth, and asking questions about how categories of youth are produced and for whom, how family is named and recognized and for whom, how which borders are seen and unseen and in what ways. As we were doing that work, you know, we integrated the hostile terrain exhibit and a pre-reflection, and then doing the work and a post-reflection as a part of that. And because of COVID, we did not come to the post-reflection and actually do the work, but when we took it up in the context of thinking also about the politics of representation, and how do we tell stories about the border? How do we think about, and we looked at a wide variety of different projects that have worked to highlight the structural violence of different borders, but sometimes in ways that that may cause added harm. And one of the things that my students thought a lot about and wondered a lot about within this project was questions of what they were calling trauma porn, and the ways in which we do or don't highlight violence and suffering as a means of drawing attention to problems. And just a quick piece on trauma porn. This is from just an opinion piece. We looked at lots of different work on it, but this is Chloe Melly's work. Broadcasting someone's pain is exploitive, dehumanizing, and voyeuristic. There is nothing that a disquieting video or picture can accomplish that pre-existing written or oral testimonials from those who suffer could not have accomplished better. We should not have to see people's pain to witness them at their most vulnerable and frightened to believe their pain is real, that socio-political and economic forces have forced them into a state of vulnerability. We shouldn't have to see blood to believe that it has been unfairly and repeatedly spilled. And versions of this have been really important in the field of education, where we spend a lot of time thinking about the destructiveness of damage-centered narratives that approach people as damaged or as problems. And students raised lots of questions as we looked at this exhibit. One student asked, "I can't help but wonder why this information has to be displayed in such a manner. Why toe tags? Besides acknowledging the person is dead, what else does it convey? Is the toe tag more personal or impersonal than a backpack? Does a toe tag simply reduce a migrant experience to the body? And if there's no evidence of a body, does that mean that the experience becomes irrelevant? Is the migrant experience then only reduced to that of pain, suffering, and death?" And that's a quote from one of the student papers who granted me permission to share. And these are questions that I carried with me from my students, and that students carried with them into work on the exhibit. Students also carried questions about the emotional space of the exhibit. So one student wrote, "When taking a virtual tour of the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit, I was overcome with emotion. The emotion I felt was fear, devastation, and sorrow, causing me to ask myself, how can a country that I am a citizen of create such turmoil and death? Yet remembering the history of affliction that this country has caused because of the color of my skin, recognizing that my skin posed an everlasting threat to a country that kidnapped, raped, lynched, killed, and enslaved my ancestors. Also reminding myself that this nation only believes that those who are citizens of this country reflect a physical image that does not look like mine." And so students also spend a lot of time reflecting on their own positionalities and the interlocking histories of different forms of structural violence and the ways in which they appeared or didn't appear in this exhibit. And so these were just all these questions that I took into the space of working on the tags, which was delayed into this semester. And as we started to engage that work, it became really clear to me in the process of filling them out. We already knew that Jason De Leon himself had thought extensively about representations of violence and how we represent different forms of violence, and was really intent on showing the structural violence of US policy, and in a way that was not about making a spectacle out of people, but rather drawing our attention deeply to the consequences and effects. And one of the things that he writes about, and that became so evident and that really rose to the surface in the process of working on these tags, is necroviolence, and the violence done not only to people in the process of crossing, not only in death, but also the violence done to people's bodies. And so he writes of necroviolence as violence performed and produced through the specific treatment of corpses that is perceived to be offensive, sacrilegious, or inhumane by the perpetrator, the victim, and her or his cultural group, or both. And he also writes about how the desert becomes a remote deathscape, where American necropolitics are pecked onto the bones of those who we deem excludable. And he writes about the desert essentially becoming a space that resembles other settlements, where symbolic exclusion is constructed through the creation of a barrier made of essentially of harmed and tortured body parts. And so that the idea of prevention through deterrence becomes the desert, the bodies left in the desert reveals what the physical boundary of sovereignty and the symbolic edge of humanity look like. And so this becomes a space where the living remnant, the remnants of the torture and execution of humans via policy is imagined as the actual border wall. And so, and I think that the act of filling out the tags really, and naming the causes of death, writing the causes of death, writing the body conditions of people, complete skeletonization with bone degradation, fully fleshed, exposure, probable hypothermia. The act of engaging with this really concretized, and at the same time forced a reckoning with the kind of, with the very kinds of things students were worried about, I think, in terms of how does it, are there moments in working with these tags where we're forced to reconcile with our own possible, where we lose attention on the life represented there, where we're focused on the details of writing and rewriting and we mess something up and we have a moment where we have to start over, or where the sheer volume of them pushes us into a space of momentarily forgetting. So it's also an architecture and emotional investigation of how we engage with mass death and what it means to become numbed, reaware, to numb out and re-engage and process and try to be present with this kind of violence. And so in that, the work that is done on, and of course, you know, I think De Leon derived his exhibit from watching MEs do this work and from doing this work himself. And this is the daily work, the sort of labor of border enforcement is filling out death tags, partly. And trying to track down family and trying to figure out the identities of people whose bodies can't be identified. And so I wanted to sort of name that space. I'm watching the clock and I really want to leave space for questions. So I'm going to rip you through in about 2 minutes a set of slides that are about just thinking broadly about the different work that people are doing and the art of the border. So, you know, just calling out a couple of organizations, the work around Free Them All that is happening in lots of different spaces. This is Puente, but thinking about COVID as another site of violence and as another site of racialized political violence that is affecting migrants, poor people, community of color, incarcerated people, and there's mass organizing about that. Close the Cages movements to shut down camps, abolish ICE. This is action focused on Irwin coming out of Project South, and thinking about Georgia, where sterilization of migrants, reproductive rights of incarcerated people have become fundamental critical issues. I want to call out the Indiana Undocumented Youth Alliance, who's been doing incredible work in Indiana on, and also working with the Indy 10 and Movement for Black Lives on just thinking about how to build interconnected movements. This is Transqueer Pueblo, who I was introduced to through the Border Studies Project, who are doing really powerful work on supporting trans and queer migrants and doing organizing. This is a vigil in Toronto. This is Families Belong Together. .org has been creating an opportunity for people to organize vigils for about family detention. And then also highlighting and thinking about just the different ways in which art is used as a tool to raise awareness of the border. And this is a piece by a French artist, J.R., of a boy looking over the border fence. This is the Brotherhood mural put together by Enrique Chui that is a massive expanse of the border. I think 2,600 people are participating in the creation of messages on the Mexico side of the border with this. And then as the last piece, just as we're thinking about intersectionality, and this is at Carnes Detention Center in particular and in March, but Raíces has made an important report calling attention to how systemic racism affects Black immigrants in particular, many of whom are Haitian. And so those are just, I think, some different spaces that we also can think into in terms of thinking about intersections between different movements and representation. And I will end there. With gratitude to my students, so much gratitude.
Thank you so much, Professor Alexander. That was wonderful. I wanted to say that Professor Boyce, you really touched on something that was important to this exhibit in terms of it was originally planned specifically for this moment in time, right? Specifically to be coming out to kind of push the conversation, the national discourse on borders and immigration. And we were originally going to have some of the tags from each of the over 150 host organizations sent back to form an enormous HE94 exhibit in Washington, DC, and we weren't able to do that. But I'm so glad that you spoke very in depth about the changes that we've seen under the current administration, and that was really important. And that was actually one of my first questions, but you already covered that, so that's great. And Professor Alexander also had wanted to talk with you about how your students shape your understanding of all of this, and you did such a beautiful job. Thank you for sharing that. One thing I do want to get into, and I encourage folks, we have upwards of 70 attendees watching us. Thank you so much. If you have questions, please insert them into the chat or the Q&A. And but I did want to ask, De Leon uses Giorgio Agamben's idea of state of exception, right? And he says, he quotes it as this process whereby sovereign authorities declare emergencies in order to suspend the legal protections afforded to individuals while simultaneously unleashing the power of the state upon them. And then De Leon talks about border zones become spaces of exception. And I'm just wondering how you see this idea of spaces of exception expanding beyond just border zones. Because I think I heard in each one of your presentations examples of ways in which we can push, again, this idea of states of exception or spaces of exception beyond just the border. And just wondering if either one of you wanted to touch on that.
I'll say a couple of comments, and then I invite Professor Alexander to share hers as well. I kind of there's two things that I think are important to say about that. One is one of my teachers and mentors, Isabel Garcia, who is the founder of the Coalición de Derechos Humanos in Tucson, in Southern Arizona, has always maintained that, in fact, everything that we see that the border is essentially a laboratory, right? That it's a testing ground, and that everything that gets done on the border eventually is likely to be exported to other parts of the country. And we've seen that with, for example, the erosion of procedural protections reflected through programs like Operation Streamline that's made its way into drug courts and so on. We saw it in a big way this summer when, in an effort to crack down on the Black Lives Matter movement and the uprising happening nationwide, who was it that was sent in as paramilitary federal forces to directly attack protesters in cities like Portland and Kenosha, et cetera? It was Border Patrol. It was BORTEC, their tactical, basically SWAT team, special forces units. We've seen border surveillance infrastructure redeployed for other kinds of domestic policing. And of course, the US has this very expansive definition of what the border is. It's 100 miles inland of all land and sea borders. Technically, that's the legal jurisdiction in which Border Patrol are allowed to operate. And the ACLU has mapped this out and shown that ultimately that encompasses all the major cities along both seaboards, as well as in the Southwest, San Diego, El Paso, on the northern border, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo. That encompasses 2/3 of the US population. And so I also think that you know, I understand the argument around the kinds of the rhetorical justification for state violence that's used in the borderlands, framing what is framing the kinds of threats that exist here as exceptional and therefore justifying these kinds of actions. But I think it's a mistake to accept that kind of rhetoric at face value. Because ultimately, you know, these spaces and these areas are not apart in any meaningful way from the rest of the country or the rest of the world. They're, you know, everybody who crosses through the borderlands is trying to get somewhere else, right? If you know, in the context of migration, and again, the policies themselves have this tendency to, and the practices, the tactics have this tendency to migrate. I think that, yeah, we have to understand that what's happening here is totally interconnected with things happening in Indiana and anywhere else, in Chicago, anywhere else in the country.
Building onto that, partly I think historicizing the idea in a couple different ways. When people talk about family separation, on the one hand, this is a very recent Trump administration invention on the US-Mexico border, a very intentionally planned deterrence policy. On the other hand, the separation of families and children is a longstanding racialized practice in the United States via enslavement, via indigenous boarding schools, and indigenous separation via SCOOP. And so there is I think there's a need to question and interrogate, sorry, my light goes off, the idea that it's spaces of exception, but also bodies of exception, and the ways in which exception becomes tied to particularized race, class, gendered, sexualized bodies in the context of US policymaking and global policy.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that's what I've kind of been thinking through and encouraging my students to think about, how it's not tied to these spaces, but how bodies in and of themselves moving across spaces are still being treated as if they're as if they're part of the state of exception, right? So I'm so glad that to hear you kind of help me kind of unpack that a little bit. Another question this was a question from one of my students, and students were at the heart of Jason DeLeon's work, and really at the heart of thinking about his work with the Undocumented Migration Project that he founds and directs. And they're also kind of an example of his work sort of as in public anthropology. And both of you has unique experiences working with local communities and a more public approach to academia. And so I was just wondering, students often ask, you know, how can I get involved? How can I be more? And Professor Alexander, you gave us lots of different examples there of organizations, but I was just wondering if you might talk a little bit about the challenges of bridging your academic and your community work with border studies.
Gosh, I feel like I would love Dr. Boyce to talk about this, because they are so tightly interwoven and integrated in that context. I mean,
I'll say a few words and then I'll pass it back. I mean, I think that it's what Professor Alexander is saying is true. As a program, the Border Studies program is fully grounded, you know, from a standpoint of curriculum, from the standpoint of kind of the structure of how our program functions, right? The way that our curriculum is designed, epistemologically, right? We're really grounded in the stories and perspectives and priorities of the people who live in borderlands communities who are being impacted by the policies we've been talking about. But I'll say from a personal standpoint, there's a lot that you know, it's an incredible privilege. I think we should acknowledge just what a privilege it is to be have the opportunity to get a degree, a college degree, a university degree. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into it too, and I don't want to minimize that. And it, you know, there's a lot of growth and challenge that people have to fight through to ultimately arrive at that finish line. But like, it's also a huge privilege, and most people don't get that opportunity. And there's all kinds of skills and opportunities that you can accumulate in the course of this. And I think that like my basic advice to anybody who is, trying to think about these questions of, how do you bridge that with like community work, like make it count, I mean, like find some way to apply those skills and the kinds of benefits that are going to come with having a degree. If you go on to graduate school, like find ways to make it really count for the kinds of communities that you have relationships with, for the kinds of like political movements and issues that you care about. There's all kinds of ways that you can do that. And I mean, that's something everyone needs to figure out. But I think that there's a responsibility that we all have who have had the opportunity to have these opportunities to then apply them in ways that really can make an impact on the world. So
thank you so much. I'm just going to just looking at time, but we have a really great question from Professor Keeker that I want to get to. And so he asked, can you speak to the significance of disappearing people, so not just killing them, as part of prevention through deterrence, especially how it connects to the military doctrine of counterinsurgency used in Mexico and Central America? He says that he noted in one of Jeff's slides the crosses with desconocido on them, and filling out tags, many had unknown for the name. In what ways is there a connection between the long history of counterinsurgency and state of exception, and how does this connect to necropolitics?
Yeah, so I'll tie it into the last one. I think on the last one, give of your time, invest your time and your energy, and be really humble about your knowledge. I mean, and connect, do work for and with organizations. And then I came into this work through Latin American solidarity work, and eventually through thinking about El Salvador intensively, Guatemala, and the history of counterinsurgency efforts, movements to suppress and repress and violently shut down grassroots movements in those countries and contexts for decent living conditions and more humane political economy. And U.S. has been very actively involved for a long time in funding and supporting and training aggressive military intervention, supposedly anti-Marxist, but just broadly very pro-U.S. capitalist leadership. And disappearance has been a core part of that, right? That counterinsurgency, one of the tactics has been torturing and disappearing people who are involved in movements for social change and social justice. And so, disappearance and Professor Keeker's asking about the relationship between that and disappearance on the US-Mexico border, and the particular kind of torture that is disappearance, that is being unable to identify your loved one, being unable to know what is happening to them or what has happened to them, searching for years and years and years, and whole families across, and De Leon does a very powerful job of representing this, families across geographic time and space, searching across countries, across borders, just and that continual process of unknowing as one form of necroviolence, which is tied to necropolitics, a politics of death.
If I can add briefly to the question on counterinsurgency. I know we're pressed for time. I also think it's important to acknowledge, if we look at the roots of prevention through deterrence, it emerged out of a consultation between the federal government and Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico, which is actually owned by the Honeywell Corporation, but is one of three national security Cold War era nuclear policy, basically think tanks and research laboratories that was, like I said, developed during the Cold War. And I think that's important, right? Because if you understand basically like the intellectual building blocks of prevention through deterrence, and also the very architects of this policy, right? There's a direct continuity to that larger story of counterinsurgency. And so I think that the fact that we see the same kinds of patterns of death and disappearance and the necropolitical kind of logic animating this that Professor Alexander has talked about, I think shouldn't be seen as a coincidence. It's these same kinds of actors in the national security establishment who were, throughout the Cold War, behind a lot of the kinds of counterinsurgency tactics and practices that were exported to places like Latin America and Vietnam and so on. And ultimately, I think the project, right, that they've attempted to pursue is one of social engineering through violence. How do you mobilize violence in a way that's most effective to accomplish the kinds of, policy outcomes that you want. And I think that's exactly the right way to understand what's been happening on the border, right? This attempt to amplify violence in a way that optimizes a particular set of policy outcomes. And that recognizing that, I think, also is important for then informing like our analysis with the very movements in Latin America that for a really long time have been naming this, like the consequences of counterinsurgency and fighting back against this. So I think that's important as well.
Absolutely, thank you. And our final question we have is in the chat for Professor Alexander. I don't know if you got a chance to see it, about the art activism and its ability to inspire policy change. And I don't know if you want to tackle a portion of that question.
Sure. I think probably my sort of theoretical foundation is that the most effective mechanism for policy change is mass mobilization. And that the mechanisms for why and how that happens are complicated, but I think art has a power to crystallize meaning, to provoke really hard questions. I mean, I think my experience with this exhibit, for example, was about really being provoked into a much deeper understanding of necroviolence and of the sort of and of the meaning of mass death. And so I think that art, it also, I think the exhibit is also functioning to sort of bring us together around this topic, around these set of questions, to connect to organizations, to connect to work that is happening on the ground, to initiate conversations. And I think that, there's a lot of, I think in this, I think artists need to be mindful, right? And the sort of connection, the question for me is, how is the art connected to movements? How is it connected to other spaces of action? How is it, who is it for, and how? So one of the projects we looked at was the Lampedusa boat project in Italy, and there have been some good analyses and questioning of sort of, whose experience was being honored by that exhibit, and we looked at some work that was arguing that it was really the experience of Italians receiving, feeling threatened by, caring for migrants, or feeling upended, that was being sort of centered in that art. So I think always questions of who is being represented and how are they, and who is the intended audience, who is imagined as a part of it, and then also thinking concretely about agency and really recognizing migrant agency and the incredible activism and artivism and work and labor that happens on the border, and that border crossing people themselves are engaged in. De Leon's really focused on humor and thinking about the ways people utilize humor, the way they utilize and deploy and share different knowledges. And so, but it's a powerful question. I think art has an incredibly important role.
Well, wonderful. I just wanted to thank you again, Professor Boyce and Professor Alexander, for giving of your time and your energy this afternoon. I know this is a very busy and a strange time, and so I appreciate your giving to us this afternoon, and also all of the people that participated for your questions, for attending. I also want to say that I'm going to put my email in the chat, so if there are folks out there, students, faculty, or staff that are interested in helping us hang some of the, basically finishing the exhibit, which we'll be doing on Friday, you can send me an email and I will connect with you to help with that. And also, I just want to let you know that the HT94 exhibit will be available for viewing in Pila Art Center during normal building hours, which are 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. for the DePaul community, faculty, staff, and students. You can swipe in the building to see the exhibit, and it will be up through the spring semester. Thank you again, Dr. Boyce, Dr. Alexander. And if there are any students out there who I need to know are here because I cannot see you as participants, you can just put your name in the chat. So thank you again, and I so appreciate everyone being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.